the night they threw me out, the sky opened, and the only door that recognized me was one my grandfather taught me to unlock in the dark. I drove away from the Matthews mansion, with a torn wedding photo stuck to the dashboard by the rain that had followed me into the car. 8 months pregnant, I kept one palm on my belly and the other on the wheel, steering through sheets of water thick enough to make the world look like a smear. Blame had rolled off that grand stone house like storm water, subtle at first, then roaring, until it collected under my feet and pushed me out. It wasn't mine, and still it clung. The photograph flapped when the heater coughed, half of Michael's smile visible, half missing, like the part of my life everyone agreed should have been erased. I told my daughter out loud that we were going to the only place left, the farmhouse at the edge of town where sunlight used to pool on wooden floors, and the smell of solar clung to sweaters. "We'll be okay," I said, and meant it the way a person means anything at the end of a long road, by choosing to. Memory, not headlights, did most of the driving, right at the lightning-struck oak, left at the shuttered feed store, then the narrow lane where grass pressed against the car like gentle hands that still remembered me. The porch sagged the same way it always had, a proper old man's sigh. I went straight to the river rock beside the garden gnome, the one my grandfather claimed was invincible to winter. My fingers found the metal little cold mouth of a promise kept. The key was exactly where his stories said it would be, slick with moss, stubborn with time. Inside, the house inhaled me. Dust, cedar, old paper, a pantry of saved things. Silence welcomed me without questions. I set the suitcase down and stood still, listening to boards creak as if they were deciding whether I was a ghost or a granddaughter. I slept on the living room couch because that's where the only intact blanket lay, folded with the square precision of a man who fixed radios for fun. Rain and grief took turns hammering the roof. When the wind changed, the chimney sighed and the whole room smelled like a winter that had kept its word too long. The baby rolled under my palm, a shape of insistence. "I'm here," I told her. It felt important to say it in a house that collected its own proofs. Morning didn't arrive so much as reveal what the night had hidden. Light threaded through lace curtains and found yellowed photographs in the hallway. My grandfather in uniform, my grandmother with ink-stained fingers and a tilted grin. Technical books lined the study shelves with patient spines. A spare pair of glasses sat on a windowsill as if waiting for someone who'd just stepped out to check the rain. It all looked staged, like time stopped mid-sentence and no one dared finish it. On the bedroom nightstand, a pocket watch lay on a folded handkerchief as if it needed a pillow. The hands were frozen at 7:42. I clicked the crown, nothing moved. The metal was warm from the sun that had touched it, not from me, and still it felt like a pulse. I slipped it into my pocket. Talisman or dead machine, I didn't care. I needed something that believed in turning. The knock came right when the kettle began to mutter. I opened the door to Evelyn Wilson, silver hair pinned with the same precision as her stare, a casserole balanced on her palm like a peace offering. "Chicken," she said, stepping past me before I could invite her. "You look like a person who needs feeding and straight answers." She moved through the kitchen like she owned the floor plan, which in a way she did. She'd watched it for years, she told me. Watched the weeds pull at the fence. Watched men in suits sit in idle cars on the road and pretend to be looking at maps. "Your grandfather asked me to keep an eye," she said, and her voice softened at his name the way a quilt softens in the hand. "Said someday you might come back and the house should be waiting." She spoke of 3 missing years, like a rumor turned scripture. Back in the 70s, she said, he disappeared. Came back thin and quiet and building things he wouldn't name. I felt the floor tilt. I had spent childhood summers here, climbing the maple and playing librarian with his books, and somehow missed a whole secret life lifting the house from underneath. "Call James Parker," Evelyn said, as if she were handing me a flashlight. "He'll have papers. Today, if you can." She slid a note with the number across the table and watched me tuck it into my pocket alongside the watch. "Eat while it's hot," she added, and the smell of gravy made my eyes sting worse than the wind had. I ate because she would have stood there until I did. If a house can keep a secret, mine had been rehearsing for decades. When Evelyn left with promises of groceries and a quick return, I walked the hall like a person reading a map. The ceiling hatch to the attic stuck only once, then the ladder folded down with a dusty courtesy. I climbed carefully, body forward to protect the baby, and found the false panel my grandfather had once told me was "for mice" that read. It shifted beneath my palm. Behind it, set on the old plank floor as neatly as a place setting, an ornate wooden chest waited. Concentric rings of metal hugged its lid, each etched with symbols that meant nothing to me and everything to Patience. I touched it, and the dust print my fingers left made it look like the chest had been holding its breath for years and finally let some out for me. Some locks don't want a key, they want a memory. The chest sat there like a riddle that had dressed up for dinner. 3 rings, each with symbols that refused to be letters, metal cool as skepticism, wood polished by the hands of a man who loved both machines and mysteries. I tried the polite approaches first: birthdays, anniversaries, the date my parents met, entering numbers on the little inset wheels as if good manners could solve math. The chest was unmoved. It wasn't that it wouldn't open, it just wouldn't open for a story I didn't actually know. I climbed down and canvassed the study like a detective who happened to be barefoot. My grandfather's books had always been the kind that expected you to have pencil in hand. I pulled one after another until I found the battered copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with the spine mended by library tape and affection. He had read it to me every summer on the porch, doing voices until I laughed. The margins were full of his neat handwriting: tiny equations, star maps, hash marks like steps along a ladder. On the inside back cover, a number string had been underlined twice, and once so hard the paper had nearly torn. It looked less like a code and more like someone tapping you on the shoulder. I copied it onto the back of an old receipt with a stubby pencil and told the book "thank you" under my breath. The farmhouse phone rang. I didn't know the line was still active. The sound shivered down the hall like something from a movie that wants to warn you about the second act. "Grant residence," I said before I could stop myself, and a man's voice said my name as if he were verifying a password I hadn't agreed to share. "Arthur's granddaughter," he said, pleased. "I understand you've taken up residence in Arthur's home." "Who is this?" I asked, polite first because fear comes after for me, always a gentleman. "Be careful who you trust," he said, as if the sentence mattered more than his name. The line clicked dead. I put the receiver back like it weighed a pound more than it had a minute ago, and stood in the quiet kitchen feeling the house get smaller and sharper, the way a room does when you realize someone has been watching it longer than you have. Back in the attic, the chest waited with the indifferent patience of an old queen. I tried the numbers from the book, nothing. I tried them backwards, still nothing. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard popped, and my skin remembered what it's like to be a little girl sneaking cookies from the tin. I set my hand in my pocket, found the pocket watch, and thumbed the stuck crown. 7:42, again insisting. What if the watch wasn't a relic but a nudge? I aligned the rings to 7:42-159-31, fingers clumsy with cold and doubt. The smallest click seemed to open the larger kind. The lid lifted as if exhaling, as if something elastic inside me had too. Inside, velvet, the color of ink. On it, my grandfather's leather journal with his initials pressed into the cover like a signet. Beneath, a folded blueprint yellow with patient waiting. At the bottom, a photograph of him in a lab coat, flanked by serious men with the tired eyes of people who finish things. They stood in front of a building I didn't recognize. His smile was the same one he wore after fixing the toaster. Quietly, pleased, privately amused, already thinking about the next problem. I opened the journal. The first page said, "For Sarah when the time comes, trust no one." The handwriting wasn't theatrical. It was precise the way warnings are when they've been practiced in the head 1,000 times before being written once. My name on the page hurt in a good way and a bad one. I turned another page and stopped, because it felt wrong somehow to read it, standing in dust and heartbeat. I wanted a table and a lock on a door, and a cup of tea with a literal plate beneath it. Downstairs, the front latch clicked. Evelyn swept in with 2 grocery bags and news about the man at the hardware store who'd tried to sell her the wrong kind of nails. She put milk in the refrigerator as if she'd never stopped doing it. "You called Parker?" she asked without looking up. "I will," I said. "Not will." "Today," she said, and slid a folded paper with his office address across the table. "He's a man who thinks better when the clock is running." I tucked the journal into my tote, the blueprint behind it, and the photograph into the zip compartment where I kept my driver's license, as if being beside me could anchor it to the present. When I stepped onto the porch, the rain had wandered off and left the world wiped clean and a little dazed. The gravel crunched in the driveway the way it used to when Grandpa came home with bread and the evening paper. For a second I had to stand still and let the 2 times slide across each other and settle. The difference between paranoia and precaution is whether you're right. Parker's office was in a Victorian with better posture than I had that morning. Brass plaque, polished door, curtains that made you want to apologize for the dust on your shoes. I put my hand on the latch and saw my reflection darken in the glass as a black sedan glided into a street spot without signaling. Another slid in behind it, idling like a patient threat. 2 men sat inside, the kind of men who wear their suits like uniforms and their expressions like blank checks. I breathed once, twice, the way nurses teach you, and walked into the law office as if the timing were mine to keep. The plaque shone on the wall, and in the street behind me the engine stayed running. Parker greeted me like a calendar event my grandfather scheduled 5 years after his funeral. He said my name as if he'd been practicing it, then waved me into a leather chair that fit the way old truths fit, a little too well. "Your grandfather set the property in trust," he explained, sliding a folder toward me. "Transfer triggers only if you return of your own free will. Return, not inherit. Come back, not be handed." It was exactly the kind of test Arthur Grant would design. No rescue clause, only a door you had to choose. Parker crossed to an oil painting of the courthouse, swung it aside, and spun the dial on a wall safe with a confidence born of repetition. Inside, a sealed envelope with my name in his neat engineer's hand, and a private addendum to the will that read like a map, annotated by a man who had run out of synonyms for danger. Names sat on the page like loaded switches. Monarch Industries. Ellison. The catalyst! I said the last one out loud and felt my pulse change speeds. "What's under the house is worth killing for," Parker said, not unkindly. My daughter kicked hard enough to make the paper tremble in my hands, as if she had opinions already. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Parker, 2 gentlemen here, asking about the Grant property. No appointment." The word gentleman rang like a lie. Parker didn't waste a second. He pressed a recessed latch. A bookcase swung open on a narrow corridor. "Back exit," he said, ushering me through. "Evelyn is waiting in the alley." He pressed the envelope into my palm and spoke as if timing was a tool. "Red engineering book at the farmhouse, shelf 3, left side, page 42. Follow exactly. And Sarah, trust but verify. No one comes in unless Evelyn is beside them, not even me." The last sentence felt like a password and a benediction. Through the thin office wall, voices floated in, softened but unmistakable. One of them was the calm baritone from last night's call. "Is this the Grant residence?" Now rendered in daytime vowels. Too close to be coincidence. I didn't wait to be sure. Evelyn's sedan idled in the alley with the passenger door already open. I slid in. Rain-damp air rushed around us. "Monarch," I said. She answered with the pedal. Brick and glass blurred backward. We hit the main road like a decision. When a lawyer speaks like a firefighter, you don't wait to smell smoke. I held the envelope against my belly like a shield. and watched the town pull itself together in the rearview mirror. Somewhere in those offices, men with good shoes were saying my grandfather's name, as if it were a problem to be solved. I made a different vow. I would not be a secret anymore, just not theirs. Back at the farmhouse, the doorbell rang before the kettle could boil. 2 men stood framed by the storm door, polite smiles, expensive raincoats, the weatherproofed confidence of people who never enter a room without a number ready. "Ms. Grant," the taller one said, presenting a card that gleamed like an apology. "Chen, this is Mercer. We represent Monarch Industries." His smile added $4 million unsaid dollars to the threshold. I kept the chain latched. They brought glossy cards and a price for my child's future. The chain stayed put. Chen tucked his card through the gap like a communion wafer. "Green Energy Initiative," he said, as if the phrase could soften a takeover. Mercer kept his voice low and compassionate. "We're prepared to resolve certain title irregularities. Liens can be exhausting." The word liens slid in like a draft under the door. Behind their smooth syllables, heard a clock winding in the wrong direction. I turned their card over with my thumb. The emblem caught the light. A monarch butterfly whose wings weren't wings at all but interlocking geometric patterns, kin to the carvings on my grandfather's chest. Nothing about any of this was random. "The property isn't for sale," I said. "At any price." Their eyes flicked from my belly to the door frames, measuring access the way engineers measure tolerances. People like them never left without taking something, even if it was just a good look. They thanked me for my time the way hunters thank the wind, then walked the perimeter in slow, proprietary arcs, phones held chest high. Through the lace curtain, I watched lenses catch the exact contours of my grandmother's lilac bush, the root cellar vents, the ground that knew more than I did. "They're hunting for below," Evelyn said at my shoulder, not bothering to whisper. I didn't bother to argue. Upstairs, the attic smell hugged me with old wood and older intentions. I opened the journal on my knees. 1974 began bright, notations like sunlight, enthusiasm underlined twice, then tilted. Surveillance microphone found in office. Security says for project protection. The writing tightened as the pages turned. He described the catalyst with a tenderness that felt like prayer, an engine for abundance, not extraction. Then the shadows lengthened. "Ellison wants weaponization," one entry read, and a coffee stain bled over the word, like the hand that made it had shaken. Several pages had been torn out, history amputated. 77 returned in a different hand, the same man written by a narrower pen. "They kept me 3 years," he wrote. "I escaped with the prototype." The word escaped sat there unapologetic, a scar line healed but visible. After that, the journal turned practical. Sketches, measurements, a drawing of the root cellar foundation captioned with a quiet dare. Fibonacci numbers marched like a sequence of stepping stones. "Press in order," he'd scrawled. I wiped my palms on my jeans and went to the cellar. Stone sweats when it's nervous. I swear it does. I pressed the first rock, then the second, fingers counting the way he taught me. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, until the wall made a sound like a throat clearing. Mortar shifted. A seam appeared where none had been. Behind it, a keypad winked to life, incongruous against stone. I set the pocket watch in my palm. 7:42. So be it. I entered what the house had been telling me since I walked in, the time it stopped. The keypad accepted the past as present. "DNA match required," a calm synthetic voice added, as if asking for sugar in my tea. I pressed my hand to the panel. It warmed, then flashed green. "DNA match. Welcome, Sarah Grant." Stones whispered against each other. The wall became a door, the way nothing becomes something, by moving. Cool air breathed out of the opening, clean and purposeful, a different atmosphere altogether. Some doors open because you're smart, others because you're someone's blood. The passage sloped down in a gentle, engineered grade, lights blooming awake ahead of us in obedient sequence. Concrete walls should have felt like a bunker. Instead, they felt like a vow. Cables ran in disciplined bundles along the ceiling. No tangle anywhere, no improvisation, only intention. At the first landing, the space opened and kept opening. An underground laboratory big enough to hold a second life, ringed with workbenches organized by obsession, energy, chemistry, biology, each station labeled in my grandfather's tidy hand. In the center, a cylindrical chamber sat empty on its throne of cables, indicator lights winking like stars you only see when you finally turn off the porch lamp. I stepped in, felt the weight of the house above me and the safety of the rock around me, and knew two things at once. I was late to my grandfather's story, and right on time for my own. The day I found the room under my house, I realized my grandfather built a cathedral to science where the floorboards should have been. The passage gave way to a space that didn't ask permission to exist. Benches were arranged in a precise circle, each station an altar, energy here, chemistry there, biology beyond. A ritual of order only one man would keep for decades. Diagrams slept beneath glass like pressed leaves. Circuit paths, resonance maps, error margins annotated with a mechanical pencil's quiet faith. Even silence had a hum down here. Prototypes thrummed the way bees do when they're thinking, content and busy and slightly dangerous. At the center, a cylindrical housing waited, cables braided into it like veins into a heart. The chamber was empty, but the readiness vibrated in its posture. Monitors blinked in standby, patient guardians blinking at me like owls in a library. We see you, we remember you. Show us you know how to read. I took one step and heard a soft motor above. The ceiling camera pivoted to greet me, red status light winking once. I hadn't pressed record. Someone already had. I looked down, half expecting footprints to appear beside mine. Station 3. Recording. My grandfather labeled everything as if he knew I'd arrive shaking. I slid the drawer open and found a camera kit nested in foam cutouts, each cable coiled and secured as if the opposite of panic could be taught by packing. The instruction sheet was a page and a half, bullet points minimal and exacting. Step by step my hands steadied. Tripod, power, HDMI. Angle to include the main workstation. When I turned the main screen on, it didn't ask for a password. It went straight to his face. Weeks before his death, but older than the version in my memory, Arthur Grant looked directly through glass and blood and time. "Sarah," he said, and my name arrived in me like a key slides home. "If you're watching this, the system recorded your entry. That buys you hours, not days." He didn't waste breath on apologies. He explained the catalyst the way he had taught me chess. Plain language made sharp. Near total conversion efficiency, he said. Not summoning energy out of magic, but refusing to spill what already lives in the system. "Scale it," he said, "and you could power a city block indefinitely. Scale it wrong, reverse the principles, and you can drain power. Infrastructure first, then anything electrical, then, if you're cruel or desperate enough, cells." He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The camera caught the tendon in his jaw when he said, "life." He'd seen Monarch's eyes when they realized the reverse mode potential. He built a flaw into every prototype, a bridge he alone could cross. "What they've spent decades trying to replicate," he said, "is a path I preserved for you." His mouth softened on the last word. For you. I felt my daughter kick against the laptop of my fear. 3 options, he said, holding up 3 items I would later recognize on a shelf I hadn't noticed yet. Publish everything through secure channels. Let knowledge be the lock and the key. Or destroy it all. Leave nothing for weaponry and nothing for wonder. Or take up the work where I had to put it down. He didn't say which he wanted. He said, "Decide fast and decide in daylight. Panic loves the dark." A countdown clock bloomed on the second monitor, 10:42:17, and falling with the indifference only numbers have. My heartbeat tried to keep pace and failed. I watched the minutes behave like they belonged to someone else. Legacy is heavy. It gets heavier when it's alive. At Station 3's bottom drawer, under the neatly stowed microphones, I found a thumb drive and a device the size of a matchbox with one recessed button. In my grandfather's handwriting, "Emergency exit, 1 time." I slipped both into my pocket. The room's air tasted filtered, unlike the farmhouse above. Even the ventilation sounded intentional. Every contingency was a staircase he'd built for me, assuming fire. I wandered the circle on purpose. Workbench labels kept time as well as any clock. Materials registry. Failure logs, my favorite phrase of his. If you're not cataloging the no, you'll never trust the yes. Along the back wall, filing cabinets wore his hand like uniform nameplates. Catalyst Protocol Gen 1.3, Biointerface, Legal, Trust. To the left, a paneled section of concrete didn't match the pore lines around it. The safe was set there, flush with the wall, face smooth except for a keypad. A retinal lens, a square for a palm, and a slot so discreet I'd have missed it if the camera's light hadn't glanced off the edge. Before I went upstairs, I sat where he must have sat when he recorded his message. The chair fit me. In the reflection, I could have sworn our shoulders had the same slope. "Okay," I told the empty chamber, the circle of benches, the camera, and its obedient eye. "We're here. We're listening." Tires on gravel have a very specific grammar when they arrive with bad intentions. The sound filtered into the rock, slower than upstairs, but unmistakable. I killed the monitor, pocketed the thumb drive, and tucked the matchbox device where my body knew it was without having to check. Then I climbed, hearing the clock downstairs become other people's shoes. On the driveway, the Lexus that knew my in-laws, the Mercedes that belonged to a man who liked to sign checks before reading the fine print, and a third car with a past, a black sedan whose driver's door opened like a history book. Warren Ellison stepped out of the third vehicle with the posture of someone who expects the world to tilt when he speaks. I didn't let it. My in-laws brought fresh apologies and an old enemy. I kept my back to the stairs. If they wanted what lived under the kitchen, I wasn't going to frame the door for them. "Ms. Grant," Ellison said, extending a hand as if we were meeting at a ribbon cutting. I let gravity keep my arms at my sides. Eleanor and Richard Matthews flanked him, dressed like grief had been ironed flat. On the coffee table lay an envelope I hadn't opened yet. Richard opened it as if the paper belonged to him. "A lien," he announced, smooth as dish soap. Monarch letterhead. The kind of forgery that bets on exhaustion more than truth. "You imprisoned my grandfather," I said, putting the quiet part on the table where even Eleanor could see it. Ellison's smile tilted, but did not fall. "Arthur was a valued collaborator," he said, tasting each syllable for plausible deniability. "Security concerns were misinterpreted." He said security the way some people say mercy. Before I could ask him whether the misinterpretation lasted 3 calendar years, Parker and Evelyn arrived like oxygen. Parker's voice stayed even, which was how I knew he was angry. "That lien won't survive the first breath of court air," he said, setting his briefcase down between Ellison and my living room. "And Ms. Grant will not be meeting with you without counsel." The standoff ended not with words, but with the slow collapse of poses. Ellison tucked his threat back into a smile. The Matthews did their best imitation of de-escalation. When the door closed behind them, Parker didn't sit. "Your grandfather didn't die of a heart attack by accident," he said. He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. I could feel the house listening. In that quiet, a memory rose like a path under fog. "A key that completes a circuit," my grandfather had said when I was 10, tapping the music box he'd given me. But 10-year-olds think every metaphor is a bedtime story. My childhood room still smelled like summer library. On the shelf, a wrinkle in time leaned where I'd left it years ago. Inside the front cover, taped in my own adolescent scrawl, a tiny brass key slept in yellowed tape. I held it in my palm, felt the wrongness and the rightness layered together. Not the key, the compass. The music box sat where memory said it would, in the keepsake cabinet in my grandfather's room, behind the sweaters he never stopped mending. Inlaid stars glimmered in faint mother-of-pearl, my birth constellation mapped into wood. I wound it once. The ballerina rose like muscle memory. Debussy rose with her. Then I pressed the star he'd made me say aloud in summer nights until I could find it without thinking. Sadalmilik, the luckiest star. The false bottom slid with the politeness of old mechanisms. Inside, light caught and fractured. Crystal, not metal. A key carved from something that had been grown before it had been cut. Facets catching the afternoon in a blue the sky couldn't manage. Along the shaft, etched so shallow I had to tilt it to read, completes the circuit. Glass shattered downstairs. Not the door, something closer. The pantry window. "Move," Parker called, voice low and precise. Evelyn was already in the hall behind me, eyes bright, not afraid, not surprised either. Sometimes the safest place for a miracle is inside a lullaby. We reached the pantry wall with the efficiency of people whose bodies already believed the map. Stones pressed in sequence, keypad waking to my shadow. The panel slid. The passage breathed us in. I sealed it from the inside and listened as footsteps above rearranged my kitchen into an inventory. In the lab, the safe waited like a test. I remembered the date of our last conversation before college. A hot August afternoon where my grandfather had quoted Thoreau and fed me peaches over the sink. 08/28/2010. The keypad accepted it with a neutral chime. The retinal scanner washed my eye in green. It smelled faintly like the inside of a new book. DNA confirmation required, the system announced. I pressed my palm to the square. Heat moved through it, and the voice changed tone. Match confirmed. Final authentication. Physical key, the system said, as if it had been practicing those words for years. I slid the crystal into the thin seam I'd almost missed. It nested, then bloomed, no other word for it, glowing from within with a blue that found its echo across the chamber. The safe's internal locks answered one another, metal speaking metal in a language of clicks. The door released with a sigh I felt in my sternum. Inside, on a pedestal designed to shame any jewel box, the core pulsed. Brushed titanium skin with a transparent throat, where light braided itself into a steady rhythm. Cables waited like outstretched hands. I lifted it, and the room seemed to lean closer. Upstairs, a voice I did not want to hear barked an order I couldn't make out. The clock on the wall read 07:46:22. The core's glow answered my pulse with its own calm metronome. The crystal key was still warm in my fingers when the lab lights flickered. It weighed more than metal. It weighed like responsibility. The safe sighed open, and with both palms I lifted the cylinder from its cradle, titanium cool as pond stone, with a transparent throat where light braided itself into a steady pulse. It wasn't dramatic, no hiss, no spark, just a rhythm that matched mine until I wasn't sure which beat belonged to whom. I set it on felt, and the workbench trembled the way a table does under a sleeping cat. Barely, but enough to prove the weight is real. Grandpa's notes lay beneath the pedestal in a leather portfolio that still smelled like machine oil and pencil shavings. His handwriting ran neat and unafraid across equations I couldn't pretend to solve. Quantum-level restructuring, optimization of ambient energy conversion, losses approaching zero. He'd written almost shyly, efficiency that rewrites economies. And I could see him pausing over that sentence, arguing with the word rewrites, then letting it stand because he knew it was true. A paragraph later in tighter script, reverse mode equals extraction, unacceptable. 3 lines under it, in bolder ink. Installed failsafe, genetic lock, Only AJG sequence authorizes full access. He had underlined only twice. Blood as password, legacy as firewall. Which means you, Parker said, reading over my shoulder, voice low enough not to echo. And possibly the baby. The sentence landed in my chest like an anvil wrapped in velvet. Monarch hadn't just been chasing a device. They'd been chasing a person. They'd been chasing me. My daughter kicked once, decisive as a signature. We moved without speaking to a steel table by the central console. I set the cylinder into a padded case I hadn't noticed before. Custom-cut foam, latches that clicked with the confidence of having been tested 1,000 times. Evelyn handled the portfolio, turning each page like a librarian who loved the author. Only after the core was secure did we let air in for a conversation that wasn't survival. 3 paths, I said, tapping Grandpa's margin notes where he had numbered them for my future. Publish and let the world see. Destroy and make sure no one ever will, or continue, finish what he started, this time under my rules. Each future burned a different landscape in my head. Publishing would scatter fire breaks we couldn't control. Destroying would save lives and bury wonders. Continuing would make me the fulcrum of a lever too big for one person. I could hear Grandpa's voice in my ear. Decide in daylight. A metallic clang rolled down the passage like a dropped pan amplified by stone. We all froze. Then came the second sound. Thicker, angrier, the pantry entrance giving up a hinge. The searchers had found the first door. Evelyn moved before fear could catch up. She crossed to a panel that looked like any other stretch of wall until her fingertips taught it the right sequence. The lab answered her like a well-trained horse. Steel doors slid from hidden slots, shuttering into place with rubber seals that made my eardrums pop. The circle of benches chopped into rooms, each one hermetic and defensible. The air changed character, drier, colder, the way a plane feels just before takeoff. Compartmentalization, she said, almost apologetic. Arthur never trusted a single lock. Parker was already shouldering his briefcase. The culvert, he said. Now. I clipped the case shut, checked the latches twice, and checked my hands a third time because I didn't trust them not to tremble. The emergency exit instructions were where Grandpa's video said they'd be laminated, taped beneath Station 3's drawer, written so simply a frightened mind could obey. Ladder, hatch, drift west with the grade, emerge below the ivy line. Footsteps above moved from cautious to confident. Voices bled through the wood, too muffled to parse, close enough to push blood into my throat. I slung the strap of the case crosswise so it lay against my belly like a shield, and nodded. Evelyn palmed the final sequence. The last door kissed its frame. The workshop sealed around us like a ship about to take on water. We jogged the corridor, single file, shoulders brushing conduit, past a painted stencil that read, "Emergency only," as if anyone would choose this route for fun. The lights were stingy, enough to keep your ankles honest and your head down. When we reached the ladder, Parker went first, testing each rung. I passed the case up to him before climbing, the metal cold through my jeans. The hatch complained, then surrendered. Air tumbled in, green and wet. I looked back once. The lab was a held breath. All that thinking coiled and waiting, Grandpa's life made visible in circles and lists, and the patient shine of brushed steel. "I'll be braver later," I told it, out loud, because I wanted the room to hear me make a promise. "Right now I have to be fast. Choice can wait. Survival can't." The hatch ground open to daylight, and the smell of crushed ivy found us. I boosted through the last ring and squinted at a slice of sky the color of rinsed glass. On the wind, clean and unmistakable, came the sound that makes animals run and children climb, dogs baying, not far enough away to be theoretical. We were already moving when the first bark broke into two. I learned you can drown fear with cold water and good plans. We went single file through the culvert, bodies turned sideways where the concrete narrowed, Parker's shoulders writing maps I could trust. Evelyn set a pace my lungs argued with, but my legs obeyed, her small frame making the kind of time only people who know the land can make. The catalyst rode high on my chest, like a second heart. Every few steps the case bumped my sternum, and every time it did I remembered why we were trusted with breath. The barking traveled the way sound does in a stand of trees, directionless until suddenly it isn't. When it resolved to our right, above us, sliding along the ridge like a zipper. "Creek," Evelyn said, already angling left. "Mask the trail." Parker didn't argue. We cut through brambles that braided themselves back together behind us, then down an ankle-snapping slope to water the color of bottle glass. The shock, when we stepped in, hit me mid-spine. Cold ran up my bones and pressed its palms against my ribs. I bit my lip to keep the noise in and followed Evelyn's lead into the center channel, where the current took charge of our ankles and sent both. Parker steadied my elbow when rocks shifted. Not like a rescuer, but like a partner who knows the price of a misstep. We moved upstream, sometimes sideways, sometimes hugging the bank where the root tangles offered handholds. My breath found a rhythm that wasn't panic and wasn't calm either, something between prayer and math. By the time we climbed out near the property line, I couldn't feel my shins, which was a mercy. Evelyn's farmhouse crouched behind a hedgerow that had learned discretion. Parker's sedan sat tucked by the barn, a dark shape under the swallows that loved its eaves. "Go," Evelyn said. And I did, the catalyst case leaving a wet crescent on the passenger seat that looked like a moon trying to be full. On the road, a black sedan found us within minutes and held our distance with millimeter arrogance. "They think it's a hunt," Parker said, eyes on the mirror. "Let's make it a magic trick." He didn't ask if I was up for it. He just started talking fast and quiet the way he had when we slipped the bookcase door in his office. The catalyst's case hid a locator, a detail Grandpa had tucked into his instructions with a little arrow and no commentary, as if to say, assume they're clever and make them chase your shadow. I opened the panel and pulled the beacon, a coin-sized puck with a mean little red blink, free of its Velcro cradle. "Bus station," I said. 3 miles, next exit." Parker nodded once, already angling for the turn lane. We parked where we could leave fast. Inside, Saturday metal benches hosted every version of leaving town. A family with too many suitcases, a man asleep under his cap, a college kid with a backpack plastered in stickers about causes you can't buy at a mall. I sat beside the kid because he looked like the kind of person who'd believe a stranger who told the truth. "I'm in a long, ugly custody fight," I said, which was also true in a way I didn't have time to explain. "Someone is tracking me. I need them to track this instead." I showed him the beacon without dressing it up. He glanced from the puck to my belly to my eyes. "Okay," he said, as if he'd been waiting his whole life to be someone's hinge. "Which bus?" He tucked the beacon deep in his duffel, shouldered it, and joined a line for Chicago while Parker and I melted back into the crowd the way a story does into noise. When the black sedan's driver sprinted in 10 minutes later with 2 others fanned behind him, they ran straight past us to the platform where the duffel had already become one bag among 100. We slipped out a side door and into a different life. A battered pickup borrowed from one of Parker's clients who owed him a debt and liked paying in practicalities. Its paint had once been blue. Now it was the color of work. The engine coughed awake, the kind of satisfaction you only get from machines too honest to purr. We headed north on county roads that preferred tractors, past hay bales and mailboxes that knew everyone by first name. By the time we reached the lake, the sun had remembered it could be warm. The cabin waited with a porch that sagged politely and a kitchen table that had been used for fish, cards, and arguments no one won. We turned it into a war desk in under 5 minutes. Maps, legal pads, my grandfather's portfolio, the catalyst like a lamp in the center, muted beneath its case. I plugged the thumb drive into my phone with an adapter I'd learned to carry since pregnancy turned me into a walking supply chain. The screen filled with digital arteries. Surveillance maps annotated with dates and initials, bank trails that braided bribes into boardrooms, scanned memos with names that made my throat tighten. One folder sat alone, titled in Grandpa's tidy block letters, The Trust. I opened it and found a list. Scientists, a congresswoman, a lawyer in Geneva, each name linked to public work and private courage. There was also a short video I hadn't seen. Grandpa, older and tired, said, "If you're captured, make this public." We didn't wait for captured. We started quiet distribution now, encrypted sends to addresses Grandpa had seeded, messages that made their own copies if someone tried to smother them. Parker returned from a call with the posture of a man carrying good trouble. "Help is coming," he said. Evelyn leaned her hip against the counter and said a name I'd only ever heard as a footnote in family silence. Helen Chang. When an old love walks back into a story, the plot stops pretending to be simple. We made coffee that could have woken a courthouse. We ate crackers like they were a food group. I sat with my hands on the case and let my breath loose a notch at a time, while the lake exhaled mist the color of unmade choices. Sometime before dawn, I dozed in a chair for what couldn't have been more than 20 minutes and dreamed of my grandfather's pocket watch starting again at a time it chose for itself. Gravel spoke in the gray light, the sound of tires unafraid of being heard. A modest electric car hummed into the clearing as if it had learned the lake's quiet and liked it. The woman who stepped out moved like someone who had kept promises to her body, silver hair sharp, eyes sharper. She saw me through the window and didn't wave. She came straight to the table, took one look at the case, then at my face the way you look at a portrait of a man you once loved and recognize the expression on a stranger. "I see Arthur in your eyes," she said, and without ceremony or apology, "May I see the device?" They didn't bring weapons, they brought principles and a plan. Helen touched the cylinder the way people touch relics, thumb along the seam, breath measured, eyes bright with a grief that had learned to stand up straight. She didn't ask for permission to tell me about Arthur. The room gave it. An engagement no one in my family ever mentioned. Letters burned for safety. A breakup performed not from lack of love, but because love had become a liability. Every what if in her voice sharpened my sense of what was. By late afternoon, the cabin felt less like a hideout and more like a briefing room. The trust arrived in waves. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, all restless intelligence and calloused curiosity. Congresswoman Janet Rivera, steel laced through kindness. Attorney Omar Cada, whose briefcase seemed to hum with precedence. We spread Arthur's files across the table, maps, memos, ledgers, until Monarch's crimes formed a pattern even the untrained eye could read. Bribes traced to boardrooms, disappearances tucked under R&D budgets, shell companies with patriotic names laundering the same old greed. We matched evidence to charges and charges to warrants. Rivera sketched a publication pipeline that leapt borders in a single breath. Omar sorted consent forms like a violinist tuning strings, adjusting here, tightening there, until the paperwork sang. We agreed quickly on the one monopoly we could live with. "The only safe monopoly is truth," Rivera said, and no one argued. The plan looked simple because all good traps do. I would call Ellison and ask for a meeting. We'd stage it in a hotel where federal agents could pass for staff and cameras could pass for light fixtures. While I recorded him admitting what he prefers to imply, the trust would trigger an immediate, irrevocable data dump, Arthur's research, the corporate evidence, the timelines, everything, shotgunned to academic journals, watchdog groups, and media desks that still remembered what their jobs were. No back channels, no NDAs, no secrets left to bargain with. "I'll be the bait," I said, and my daughter answered with a kick that felt like punctuation. "We're catching something bigger than us," I whispered into my own ribs. Helen nodded like a benediction and slid a maternity support band across the table. Marcus had stitched a recorder into the fabric, the kind of redundancy that made his smile look almost mischievous. 2 backups, he said. 1 live feed, 1 local. If he breathes, we'll own the breeze. Rivera had already called in a sliver of the DOJ that hadn't been bought or bluffed. They'll look like hotel staff, she assured me, because tonight they are. Omar placed a slim stack of documents in my hands. These protect you from their counterclaims, he said, and these protect your child from being weaponized by anyone's custody narrative. The word child cracked something in me I didn't know was brittle. I signed with a steadiness I didn't feel. I dialed Ellison on speaker with everyone listening, the room holding its breath like a choir waiting to come in. He answered on the first ring with that practiced warmth men in corner offices mistake for personality. I told him I wanted to talk terms for my child's security. He chose the Belmont Hotel at noon, the way a man chooses a table he thinks is lucky. Under the silk of his confidence, something frayed. Maybe it was the speed with which I agreed. Maybe it was the way I didn't pretend to like him. When we hung up, the room exhaled and then refilled with motion. Marcus packed the tech. Omar made 2 more calls to judges he trusted to still be human. Rivera rehearsed exit routes with the agents until the plan could walk itself. In the tiny bathroom mirror, I practiced not shaking. It was a terrible plan. My hands shook anyway. Evelyn came to stand behind me, small and immovable. Shaking doesn't cancel courage, she said. It just proves you brought some to spend. I tucked Grandpa's last letter into my bag, the one he'd sealed, for when the truth is clear. I didn't know if we were there yet. I needed something that felt like a spine. If justice is late, make it arrive like a parade. We checked mics, timelines, charges, straps. Marcus palmed the cylinder's case like a goalie palming a ball he'd never let past. Helen checked me with a doctor's eye and a lover's precision. Water, glucose tabs, a folded towel my grandmother never lived to see used this way. Rivera squeezed my shoulder once and said, "Finish the sentence your grandfather started." Omar held my gaze long enough to press the gravity flat and said, "We'll be in your ear." The Belmont's lobby smelled like expensive nothing. I crossed it with the steady walk of a woman who refuses to be escorted. The private room looked like every conference room I had ever wanted to flee. Beige confidence, a carafe pretending to be hospitality, a table that could seat 12 egos and 1 truth. Ellison sat alone at the far end, arranged like a portrait of power. He smiled the way weather smiles before it changes. He was only 1 man in 1 chair. It took his arrogance less than a minute to fill the rest of them. He called it global energy supremacy. My recorder called it evidence. Ellison didn't waste time. "We need the genetic key," he said, adjusting his cuff as if the word need weren't a confession in itself. I said weaponization the way a surgeon says malignancy, precisely without apology. He almost nodded, then corrected the word the way men correct women when the truth makes them itch. "Complete functionality," he said, and laid out his dream as if he were reading a bedtime story to a boardroom. Drain grids on command, kneecap nations without bombs, sell power back with patriotic paperwork, and a flag on the invoice. "Global energy supremacy," he murmured, and my recorder smiled without moving. He offered money first, because that's the story he knows. $5 million now, quarterly payments forever for ongoing consultation. Then he leaned closer and let his voice drop into the register where people commit crimes. "Or," he said, "we resort to persuasive techniques your grandfather found effective." The chill ran its fingers along the back of my neck and counted to 3. I kept my face steady and gave him a line I'd rehearsed until it tasted like air. "So you admit you imprisoned Arthur Grant?" He gave me the gift we'd planned for, smiling at the word imprisoned, correcting it to protective custody, adding the dates and the rationale and the national security fig leaf. My stomach rolled. The recorder drank. Rivera's timing was a drum line. The door opened with federal authority disguised as hotel service, and suddenly the room belonged to laws Ellison thought he could rent. "Warren Ellison," an agent said, voice calm and clear. "You're under arrest." I meant to say, "This is what my grandfather should have done." I got as far as, "This is what," before a contraction grabbed the sentence by the throat and bent it in half. Heat and pressure and the sound of my own breath suddenly louder than the badge in the room. Something in me let go with a warm flood that had nothing to do with fear. My water broke on a hotel chair while a billionaire heard his rights. The space split cleanly into two realities and insisted we live both. Agents moved with choreography, hands practiced, voices level. Helen appeared at my side from nowhere and everywhere, counting breaths with me, then counting seconds, then counting courage like it was vital sign number 5. Parker was already on the phone, already sprinting the car toward the back entrance. Marcus's live feed went to cloud repositories we'd salted across continents. Omar texted single words to people in buildings that don't answer calls. Rivera nodded once, and the publication pipeline went hot. Arthur's research, scrubbed of the flaws he built in and annotated with his ethics, pushing through journals, preprint servers, and watchdogs as if the internet had remembered its reason for being. Outside the hotel, Markets learned the word tremor in a new tense. We moved. Elevator, hallway, a lobby that looked exactly the same except that nothing was. Every step between chairs and curb felt like it might be the one that undid me. Helen refused to let that happen. She held my gaze and made my body a room I could stay in. Sirens in the distance, then closer. Parker's car slid to a halt at the service entrance, door open, seat already reclined. I folded myself in with the care of someone carrying two fragile things. The tires barked. We ran red lights with the blessing of agents who understood that sometimes laws must escort life. Sometimes justice and birth arrive on the same hour hand. The hospital felt like it had been expecting us. Forms thrust aside, a corridor parted. Someone asked my name. I gave them my grandfather's first because it steadied my own. Between contractions, I saw a television in the waiting area reporting Ellison's arrest, as if the anchor had been waiting years to read that sentence. A crawl at the bottom of the screen burred with numbers that meant the markets had started to believe in consequences. Another contraction hauled me underwater, and I surfaced with a single thought. Keep the breathing honest. They wheeled me into delivery, and the world narrowed to bright light. Gloved hands, Helen's voice in my left ear, Parker's in my right, Evelyn's palm on my calf like a lighthouse. The trust existed here too, in a nurse who whispered she'd read Rivera's ethics bill, in an anesthesiologist who said his sister had worked at a Monarch subsidiary and quit, in a resident who asked if I wanted the recorder still running and smiled when I said yes. Somewhere out beyond the window, open-access servers hummed, and men in rooms with views shouted at screens. In here, the only charts that mattered were the peaks and valleys of a monitor that remembered how to translate pain into proof of life. The doctor's eyes met mine with the seriousness of a contract you actually read. "One more push," she said, voice steady enough to borrow. I grabbed the rails and found a strength I did not consent to doubt. The world sharpened into a single line I had to cross. My daughter chose her entrance with perfect timing and terrible grace. She screamed her verdict into the world. The news called it a takedown. I called it a beginning. They placed her in my arms, and the room went quiet in a way I had never known quiet. Every sound softened, even the TV murmuring from its ceiling corner about charges and warrants and the market freefalls. I held her, small and furious and perfect, and said the name out loud to see if the world would accept it. Arthur Grant. It fit like it had been circling, waiting for my mouth to be brave. She blinked in that newborn way, eyes like unopened letters, and I felt my life rearrange its furniture in one breath. On the TV, Ellison's face was bracketed by words I had memorized in fantasies. Arrested, conspiracy, kidnapping. A red line crawled under a collapsing stock price, as if the market itself had learned to shame. Sealed warrants unsealed. the anchor announced, like seeds learning air. Helen, still in my periphery like a lighthouse, said, "The papers are live." Marcus, perched on a windowsill with a laptop and a pirate's grin, refreshed servers the way some people refresh faith. "Replication node's green," he reported, delighted, as if truth could be counted in check marks. Omar stepped into the doorway with a folder, and that quiet certainty he wears in place of armor. "Immunity confirmed," he said. "Paperwork filed, copies off-site." Parker slipped in behind him, smelling like cold air and adrenaline. "I've hired security for the farmhouse," he added, as if he were announcing bread had risen. "Eyes on the lane for the foreseeable future." Evelyn didn't ask permission to fuss. She set a thermos on the tray and said, "Soup's on its way when you can chew again." A nurse poked her head in and asked if I wanted the television off. I said no. I wanted Artha to hear a world bend, even if she would only remember it in the architecture of how I held her. The door opened again, and this time the weather changed. My in-laws stood there looking smaller than their money. Eleanor with her perfect hair and imperfect grief, Richard with his practiced manners fraying at the cuffs. For a heartbeat I remembered rain and a suitcase and a door that opened only to throw me out. Then I remembered that I had a door of my own now. "You can see her," I said. "With terms." They stepped close. Eleanor's hand hovered above Artha's cheek, then settled as if asking forgiveness. "She has Michael's nose," she whispered, the sentence catching on something raw. Her apology didn't arrive with trumpets. It came on foot, late, out of breath, and human. I let it stand on its trembling feet. We named boundaries without litigating old wounds. No supervision disguised as concern. No decisions without me present. Grandparents, not guards. Richard nodded like a man learning a new dance step. When they left, Eleanor looked back once with a face I recognized. Someone who had finally found a way to want the right thing. Night wrapped the hospital in that soft blue that makes everything feel borrowed. I slept with Artha on my chest, and Grandpa Arthur's letter under my pillow, the paper warm by morning from the heat of 2 heartbeats. The letter did not change in the night. Ink does not sprout new words. But something in me did. I woke with a love heavy enough to anchor a house. In daylight, the nurse wheeled in a plastic bassinet that looked like it belonged in a spaceship, and Parker wheeled in a cart that looked like it belonged in a courthouse. "Foundation paperwork," he said, tapping a stack that smelled like ink and intention. "The Arthur Grant Foundation," words I never expected to write without crying. I signed with a steady hand and an unsteady heart, my name partnering with his in a way that made time feel like a circle instead of a cliff. Omar witnessed. Helen co-signed on governance. Marcus added a sticky note that read, "Don't forget to feed the servers." Evelyn collected the pen and said, "You two will want breakfast twice." Back home, the farmhouse breathed like a place that had finally found its job. The roof creaked the way old bones creak when they're doing something worthwhile. The study smelled like cedar and coffee and a history that refused to turn mean. We changed the sheets, aired the rooms, and swept away more than dust. In the afternoons when Artha slept, I sorted Grandpa's papers into piles that looked less like evidence and more like a curriculum. At night, I learned to sleep in 10-minute chapters, each ending with a sentence that had nothing to do with fear. A legacy is just a choice you keep choosing. Weeks stitched together into a coat we could live inside. Press calls and depositions and grant applications crossed the dining table, and so did bottles and blankets and lists written one-handed. We put a crib where a filing cabinet had once squatted and a rocking chair where a safe once hid. I filed thank you notes and victim impact statements, and, when my hands stopped shaking, a petition to rename a scholarship after the 3 scientists Monarch had made disappear. Helen began sketching syllabi on napkins. Marcus built dashboards like stained glass. Janet called from D.C. with language that could outlive elections. Parker taught me to breathe through board meetings. Evelyn taught the entire operation to eat on time, and then, as calendars will, hours turned to a square I had marked without believing it would arrive. 6 months slipped past like a train that chose not to stop. The lawn had forgiven winter. The maples had remembered how to be generous. I stood in the foyer with Artha on my hip and my hand on the brass that had once been too heavy. The front doors were old and stubborn and beautiful. I opened them to a cohort of young scientists with backpacks and notebooks, and the hungry posture of people who wanted to do right. Their eyes widened at the sight of the house, their voices lowered as if entering a chapel. I led them down the corridor to the room where time had stopped at 7:42, to the watch under glass and the story etched around it. A man who refused to weaponize his genius, a granddaughter who refused to sell hers, and a future that refused to wait. I used to measure survival in nights. Now I measure it in kilowatts and honest work. Half a year remade the farmhouse without scouring away its soul. We brought the labs up into the light. Glass walls, clean benches, windows that opened to weather and not to secrets. Tour pathways wound past the restored workshop like respectful tributaries. School groups, retirees, a busload of linemen who nodded solemnly at the displays before asking the best questions. In our classrooms, ethics sat beside equations, not in a separate wing where it could be ignored. We printed Arthur's guiding principle on the first page of every binder. Capabilities do not excuse consequences. Helen taught resonance fields with the patience of someone who has argued with time and learned to leave graciously when it won. Marcus ran the public demonstration of the catalyst every Thursday at 2. The teaching model humming steady as a promise, a coffee can cylinder wearing its circuitry like jewelry. The crowd always leaned forward at the same moment, when the light flickered not because it was failing, but because it was learning to be efficient. Janet came up on weekends, hair still smelling like the city, to draft treaty language that could survive both elections and appetites. The law should outlive the people who made it, she said, and the room took notes. Evelyn ran the kitchen like a benevolent general. Menus pinned, volunteers trained, a pot of something restorative always at exactly the right simmer. She fed fellows, jurists, reporters, and the occasional bewildered tourist who arrived insisting the farmhouse had been a myth. Parker cultivated the oversight network beyond our postcode, a web of auditors, ombuds, and ethicists who understood that sometimes the bravest word in science is no. Once a month, the Matthews came with gifts measured in thought rather than price. They arrived respectfully, texting first, knocking, waiting to be welcomed rather than assuming they were. Artha knew them as grandparents, not guards. Eleanor carried picture books and stories about Michael that didn't erase me. Richard brought a willingness to listen and a knack for fixing cabinet hinges he had once assumed someone else would handle. We kept the visits short, honest, and strangely healing. In the museum wing, Grandpa's pocket watch lived in a glass vitrine on a walnut plinth. Still at 7:42, we curated it the way you tend a wound you refuse to hide. Labels accurate, context complete, no melodrama required. People read the placard, touched the glass with their eyes, and stepped back a little straighter. Some losses teach posture. Nearby, the original cylinder rested under climate control, its pulse gated, its access log a scripture of names and dates. The teaching model, wired careful and loud, sang a low workman's note that threaded through the building like a mantra. I started a family archive in the room that used to be a parlor, letters arranged by decade, court filings in acid-free sleeves, photographs labeled with more than names, feelings too. A page for Artha's footprints. A folder titled Errors and Amends. Another titled What We Refuse to Sell. Sometimes late I added a little note to myself. Not everything we keep needs to be pretty to be valuable. At dusk I walked the acreage with Artha in a carrier, her breath warm against my collarbone, her hands discovering my necklace again and again, as if it were new. We paused by the maple swing, then by the creek that had taken our scent and given us time. I told her how courage tastes different after you share it, that it gets less bitter. more like bread. She laughed at a bird, and I took this as agreement. Back inside, the fellow's chatter rose from the kitchen, like proof that community is a renewable resource. Evenings ended the way beginnings had taught them to, at the dining table that had been a war desk and then a welcome one. I kept the scars, a knife mark, a burn ring, a dent where a fist had once landed in fear. I spread out drafts for a book no publisher had yet asked for, and wrote a chapter heading in a hand that no longer trembled. What we refused to sell. It wasn't just the catalyst. It was time, dignity, names, futures. It was consent. Being visible is a practice. So is being good. When Artha slept, I walked the exhibit floors alone and listened. Museums hum differently at night, like whale song, the building reminding itself of its own shape. I checked the watch case, the cylinder's numbers, the logbooks. I jotted a note for Helen about a volunteer who needed a gentler way of being corrected, a note for Marcus about a censor with a temper, a note for myself that read, "Remember to rest." I rarely obeyed it, but I liked that I was learning to speak kindly to the person who lived in my body. The Oversight Committee had its first real fight, and survived it. That felt like a bigger milestone than any grant award. Janet called to say the treaty had made it through another committee with teeth intact. Omar sent a celebratory period in a text message like a tiny firework. Parker forwarded an email from a small-town utility that had used our open-source guides to cut outages in half. Evelyn taped a photo to the staff board of a child in a homemade future ethicist shirt, holding up a visitor badge like a passport. The world remained itself, messy, inventive, opportunistic. For every letter of thanks, a threat arrived printed on thicker paper. For every city that pledged to adopt open standards, a lobby found a new door. We answered with light and documentation, and the stubbornness my grandfather had taught me when he refused to unlock his work for harm. I kept the music box on my desk. Sometimes, when decisions crowded, I pressed Saad al-Malik and watched the false bottom whisper open and remembered that even lullabies can hide a key. Near midnight, the building settled. I checked on Artha, fist by her face, mouth around nothing, dreaming with the sincerity only the newly alive can afford. My phone vibrated on the desk like a small animal. A secure email notification lit the screen, its subject line a calm that made my stomach drop. From Zurich, from a lab with a name that sounded like a shell company wearing a tuxedo. Attempted reverse mode test detected. Unknown facility. Partial success. Requesting Arthur Grant family key. I lifted Artha from her crib and reached for the phone.